was chauffeured here by my big cousins who are way older than me, and really appreciate them taking the time to come with me today. So I'm thrilled to talk today about Black folk. It's been a labor of love and a source of joy in my life. And so to get to share it with audiences now is just been a gift. And I'm thrilled to talk a little bit about it. So, where do I begin? I'd like to begin with my roots. I am the descendant of enslaved Africans whose presence in this country I can trace back before the American Revolution. I am the descendant of rural Black Southerners who survived Jim Crow and were part of the Great Migration. I take joy in calling my ancestors names because they are my people, so I'll do that now. My maternal grandfather, John D. Duncan, was born in Elbert County, Georgia. My maternal grandmother, Brunelle Rayford Duncan, was born in Newberry, South Carolina. My paternal grandfather, Theodore Brooks Murphy, he liked to be called Bruce, was born in Accomack County, Virginia, on the Eastern Shore. My paternal grandmother, Sarah Burris Murphy, was born on the same peninsula, but a bit farther north in Salisbury, Maryland. I begin the entire book of Black folk with the story of my ancestor, my great grandfather, Solicitor Duncan. I'll read a bit to you from that. The sound of his father's voice at a whisper startled him out of his sleep. On Sundays, John D. loved hearing Solicitor's baritone, especially when it reverberated off the walls of the tiny wooden church. His father singing until the Spirit moved the congregation to shout, even before he began to preach. On weekdays, John D. was also accustomed to hearing Solicitor bellow across the wide field just outside Cannon, Georgia, warning him to stop playing the dozens with his big brother, OB, and get back to work. But that unusual night, when he heard Solicitor's voice lowered, he knew things were serious. Even as a rebellious teen, John D. was not in the habit of talking back to his father, but that night there was particular urgency in his father's tone that made it clear that there was no time to ask what was happening. Following directions, John D. packed without lighting the lantern he usually used to illuminate his steps. Muffling his curiosity, he helped his brothers and sisters load the wagon, using the moonlight as their guide. What my maternal grandfather, then only 14 years old, did know was that just a few days prior, his father had come home empty handed after settlement with the white man who owned the land Solicitor Duncan sharecropped. Rather than the work the acreage himself, the landholder who had inherited the property had subdivided it into tracts of between 30 and 60 acres and contracted with sharecroppers to farm it. In exchange for the plot and the fertilizer, the white owner would get half of the value of the crop. If he only provided the land, he would get a fourth. However, that year, the plantation owner told Solicitor that the harvest, several massive bales of cotton, had produced nothing but debt. Indeed, he claimed that after 1 year of hard work in the fields, Solicitor owed him. The owner, who had not even turned over his hands to make the land productive, decided to keep all the shares, knowing that there was nothing a Black man, even a man as esteemed within the Black community as Pastor Solicitor Duncan, could do about it. Born there in Northeast Georgia, Solicitor had done this work all his life, breaking the hard red clay to plant the rows, pulling weeds, irrigating the young plants, and then carefully harvesting soft lint cotton from the hard bolls until his fingers were numb. Solicitor knew what he deserved. Young John D. had watched his father go over the math based on the market value of the harvest over and over. The cash settlement was essential for the annual purchases his family needed and to his ability to care for his sick wife. As furious as Solicitor was, he dared not speak up. Any public hit of anger, even a calm and measured protest, could result in a lynch mob appearing in front of their home. So when the landowner lied and gave him nothing but debt against next year's crop, solicitor determined that there would be no next year in that place. He decided to take his family and run. My ancestors fled the land, all from those different places I named at the beginning of the talk. They fled the land of their birth and the places where their ancestors had been in bondage because of the violence of lynching, because of the powerlessness they experienced at the hands of landholders, because of the stilting discrimination of Jim Crow. They did not have many material possessions, but with them they carried a passion. They carried a passion for farming the land, the desire to participate in politics, a quest for education, a desire to see their hard work rewarded. They thought it right that they might have a fair shake in this world. My maternal ancestors came from Georgia and South Carolina to North Carolina. Let me show you their pictures. Where my mother, Frances Duncan Murphy, was born, and then on to Philadelphia. My paternal ancestors took the train from the Eastern Shore to Philadelphia. This long history, really my genealogy, is a reminder that although there are those who might seek to make us, Black Americans, feel like outsiders in this country, we are deeply, deeply American. The ancestors of Black Americans contributed to the upbuilding of this land. Black people cleared the ancient forest, dug trenches to drain swamps, leveled vast acreages to build plantations. They hewed the wood, they set the stones to build homes. They created places of business. They built the US Capitol. In tracing the roots of the Black working class, I begin with my ancestors. But while their stories are exceptional, they are not uncommon. So many of us have these similar stories in our families. In researching the places that they were from, places most people haven't even really heard of, I discovered much more about the stories my parents and grandparents had shared with me as a young person. I discovered a wider history of resistance, movements for better conditions, and a more humane life. I discovered democracy. Stories that should have been highlighted in our classrooms, but were not. Here on the screen, you can see um, uh, the descendants of solicitor and their spouses. In that middle picture, my grandfather and his siblings, my grandmother, Brunel Duncan, my uncle, I believe that's my uncle Rossi in this picture with this prop animal. And that's my mother as a little girl, the first picture she took in New Jersey after they migrated. And that document right there is my ancestor Henry registering to vote in 1867. So in Black Folk, I trace the work that African Americans did in this country. And one of the main jobs that was of tremendous interest to me was that of washerwomen, laundresses. So before the advent of washing machines, you had to do what she just did in sign language. You had to scrub your own clothes. You had to boil water, make soap, um, hang those clothes up on lines in the yard. It was arduous work. And in enslavement, Black women did that work weekly, often in large plantations. They would do it in what they called wash houses, a little bit separate from the main plantation house. In freedom, those same women recognized that they had an interesting set of skills, a monopoly on this work. White women tended not to wash laundry. And so they took advantage of that monopoly right away. And in one of the first unions I found among the emancipated was a union of washerwomen that came together in 1865 in Jackson, Mississippi. Those washerwomen in Jackson, Mississippi demanded fair wages, They said they would cut out any women that tried to undercut their price. And they began to negotiate with the city fathers that they would be respected, that they could do this work away from white supervision in their own yards and their own homes, and so that they could take care of their own households and watch their own children. Black people didn't need any consciousness raising to start forming those unions. They understood at the very first moment of emancipation their power. So I highlighted one washerwoman whose oral history was collected as part of the WPA narratives by a woman named Sadie Hornsby, a white woman from North Carolina who had moved to Athens, Georgia. She had quite an interesting interview with Sarah Hill. So I want to read my account of that to you. The document Sadie Hornsby drew up after their conversation, inexplicably titled B, the Washerwoman, the woman's name was Sarah Hill, reads like so many other Federal Writers Project interviews conducted by white Southerners. The misnaming in the title hints that her accounts were not a strict record of what was said and heard, but rather a set of impressionistic renderings of Black life by a white observer at the height of segregation, full of judgment, disdain, and incomprehension. Sadie Hornsby presented her ideas of a primitive washerwoman. Her report notes Sarah had, quote, cheap furniture, a leak in her kitchen, and mud in her yard, describing her as about 5 foot tall and, quote, very black, with a, quote, white cloth wound turban style around her head. Hornsby could only see in Hill the stereotype of a washerwoman that would have been unrecognizable, that would have been recognizable to white readers, black, ignorant, profoundly unknowable. Invisible to Hornsby were the skills that Sarah possessed. Sarah knew how to put the wind to work, how to make soap rise from ashes and grease, how to make industrial refuse into washpots and fire, how to take hold of hot iron to smooth and not to burn, how to make the white people's filthy things bright and white like new. This knowledge wasn't innate. These skills were her inheritance from her sisters, both in blood and in community, passed down from woman to woman, working shoulder to shoulder in concert with one another. Taking in laundry gave Sarah the power to choose who she worked for and when. The pace of her labor was set by no man. Her time was set by her own hand. This work that her ancestors first learned in slavery, but then later used to establish their own households after emancipation, formed the foundation of her freedom. So, like so many other of her peers, Sarah Hill did this work in her own yard. She raised her children. She taught her daughters how to do this work. They were assisting her the day that Sadie Hornsby came to visit her yard unannounced uh, and surprised her quite a bit. I described the work of laundry, as you can imagine, quite difficult. The work of the laundress was hard. It required toting heavy loads of dirty clothes from white customers located all over the city, drawing several buckets of water from well pumps and pulling heavy buckets to wash and then to rinse, bringing that water to a boil, then washing the clothes at just the right temperature. Laundresses managed large loads of clothes without the benefit of technology other than that of a washboard and a clothesline. They rendered fat and potash to make lye and used that lye to make soap. They devised homemade concoctions of clay and alcohol to raise stains. They added bluing to get the whites as bright as possible. In the decades before most homes had electric or hand crank mangles to squeeze water from wet laundry, they created handmade twisting devices to wring the water from sheets. Boiling wheat bran, they extracted starch to make pressed shirts crisp. Smoothed by irons, they heated in open fireplaces or in buckets of smoldering charcoal. Racial barriers left the majority of Black women among the lowest paid workers in the urban South, but they should not be remembered as unskilled. So, when I was in graduate school and we were studying labor, labor was always categorized as skilled or unskilled, which seemed interesting to me, given that oftentimes we couldn't, if you are a um, white collar employee somewhere, you could not simply step into a blue collar job and complete it with skill and dexterity. So the idea that something would be unskilled seemed rather strange to me. So it's an idea I pick at in Black folk and hopefully pick apart. Um, so laundresses were not only skilled, they also were resistant. They built networks like that one in Jackson, Mississippi, to uh, push back against the rules that society might set in their own labor. One of the most famous protests took place in Atlanta in 1881, which is chronicled by Tara Hunter in her beautiful book, To Joy My Freedom. When I went to write this chapter, I got a little freaked out because there's a whole book about washerwomen. And I was like, well, do I have something to add? Um, thank goodness technology has moved us to the point where I could do a massive search of every newspaper in the country looking for washerwomen and strike and protest and all kinds of things. And all kinds of things poured out, things I had not seen and things that were simply unfindable at a certain point in our past. So I literally found hundreds of protests of washerwomen all around the South between the 1870s and the 1930s. So let me read a little bit about that. Washerwomen's independence made them a source of fear and fascination to white customers. They were mocked by minstrels who portrayed them as slow, ignorant, and careless, while at the same time fear of them would drive urban policymaking. Police, sheriffs, and judges would target laundresses, labeling them as vagrants because of their refusal to work within white households. Their independence made them into the good help that was hard to find. Lawmakers would keep tabs on them, hoping that registries and licenses might keep them under control. But even with the measures in place, white authorities would have a hard time exerting complete dominance over their bodies, their labor, the pace of their work, and their time. Their resistance was a collective effort. Together, laundresses could take off holidays or special occasions in their own lives by simply not showing up to pick up laundry in mass without having to commit to quitting their job or begging off time time off from their jobs. As a group, these women could bring cities to a halt just by not showing up. The power of their collective consciousness would give root to movements for fair pay, boycotts against segregation, and calls for reparation. And strands of the fervent Black working class resistance, washerwomen were primed for a fight. So, in addition to studying different kinds of employment, I also began to become interested in the places where my ancestors were from. And along the way, I discovered whole labor movements that had not really been discussed in those terms. One of those movements took place in Accomack County, where my grandfather was from. Accomack County is isolated, has rich water, rich land all around it. Um, Many of the people there are the descendants of the people, the first Americans, the first settlers in the colonies in Virginia. In 1900, white farmers on the Eastern Shore created something called the Eastern Shore Produce Exchange to dominate the sale of potatoes on the Eastern Seaboard. Black potato farmers and Black laborers were shut out completely from this potato exchange, which made millions for the peninsula. Let me read a little bit about that. Despite the riches Black workers cultivated in bondage and after emancipation as free people, Black workers in Accomack, skilled farmers who owned their own land as well as sharecroppers and laborers, were some of the poorest residents in the state, ruled strictly by the small white elite in the small town of Onacoke, who attempted to wield absolute power well within the early decades of the 20th century. But by the turn of the century, in response to white violence and low pay and a prosperous economy, hundreds of Black residents on the Eastern Shore were beginning to leave, seeking work and a better life in Baltimore or Philadelphia. In fact, so many Black residents left the county that there was a labor shortage that had white landowners complaining that the quote, Negro population was drifting toward the towns and cities, and that those who remained were, quote, thriftless, not to be depended upon. An ironic claim given their own status as landholders loath to labor in their own fields. Denied the profits of the cooperative produce exchange and leveraging their power as workers in the midst of an agricultural boom, Black workers who stayed in Accomack sought to become more independent. Although there were no records of an organization extant today, what was touted as an anonymous account of a meeting was published in Accomack's local paper. Alerting white farmers, according to this breathless report, Black laborers in Accomack met in secret at night, pledging, quote, only to accept employment from white people when no other means of livelihood was open to them, and to, quote, charge the highest price for their wages that they could possibly get, and to, quote, do as little extra as possible for those employing them. Evidently, this is what Black people striving for land ownership, fair wages, and set work hours sounded like to a white observer. Black efforts at independence were just as threatening as their efforts to become equal participants in the produce exchange. News of Black people deciding to purchase from Black stores and demanding fair wages made headlines nationwide. The New York Times caught wind of the organizing efforts in Virginia, publishing a front page story claiming the quote oath not to work for white employers was quote equivalent to saying that they all will not work at all, as if self-employment and independence was an impossibility. The threat of the Black working class organizing in the same ways that white industrial workers were organizing around the country was unimaginable to many, if not most, white observers. It is in such reactions that we can see evidence of a powerful network of mutuality within Black life on the Eastern Shore. We can imagine all the ways that these Black workers are coming together. They're meeting in churches and fraternal halls, talking in lowered tones while shopping in town, sharing ideas in the field as they weeded or on the waterways as they fished, frustrated at being locked out of the opportunities that were making white farmers prosperous. We know that these organized workers, often one by one, demanded higher wages when negotiating the price of their labor at harvest. And the organizing was clearly feared by the white establishment, who began to demand that white farmers plan reprisals against the growing number of Black workers insisting on better pay. And indeed, there was an attack on the Black businesses in Onacoke, and they burned a newspaper office down to the ground. They burned a Black grocer down to the ground. They tried to lynch and kill the two men who owned those businesses. They both managed to flee and survive. One opened a business in Baltimore after he sued the county of Accomack and got a settlement for his business. But that story struck me because when we think of the thousands of people who were run out of town, whose property was destroyed and land was seized, uh, hardly any of them could sue for damages and start again. Some Black folk, I also focus on postal workers. We closely associate Black life with postal work right now. Black workers are overrepresented in the ranks of the post office around the country. In some cities, they are 75 to 80% of a postal employee. So we take for granted that the post office is a safe space, a place that welcomes Black workers. But when I trace this history, I found something quite different. Postal work is the only set of labor outlined in our Constitution, working class labor in our Constitution. Of course, the presidency and being a senator is all in there. But because the is federally guaranteed, those jobs are too. And so they take on a mark of citizenship. And because of that, um, white supremacist legislators tried to keep Black workers away from this labor. They passed multiple laws limiting postal work to white persons. First in 1802, then again in 1810, and if just in case people forgot, again in 1825. Let me read a bit from my chapter on postal work. In many ways, the transformation of the post office mirrored the struggle for fair inclusion in the armed services. After the First World War, and especially after the Second World War, Black men and women who had served in the armed forces, which were segregated and whose officers' corps were rife with Southern whites, gravitated toward postal work. A position with the post office could help ensure that their sacrifices in the military had counted for something. Their veteran status made them favored for employment, and it was a route for those seeking to leave the vulnerability of their pre war agricultural work behind. In most urban communities in both the South and North, most white collar jobs and the majority of blue collar trades were still closed to Black workers. Black Postal Union members organized, advocating for the rights of Black citizens to be fairly considered for positions. It would be their advocacy that transformed postal work from whites only employment to a growing opportunity for Black workers, finally gaining access to stable, unionized salaries and benefits that allowed generations of postal workers to become a foundation for Black communities. A fair shot at a job in the post office changed circumstances for Black people working across the country. It was not an easy fight. So here we see some of the very probably the second postal employee hired on a route. Um, William Carney, he was a Civil War veteran who was shot 5 times during the battle that's depicted in the film Glory. And so he has a postal position, probably the second postal worker in the United States to have his own route. And over here is the family of a man named Fraser Baker, who was installed as postmaster in a place called Lake City, South Carolina. I'm gonna read about that. So Fraser Baker was lynched along with his family. His wife was shot through her hand, killing her baby that she was carrying out of the postal office where they lived. Two of her other children were also killed, and her surviving children had to flee the South after his death. And so his story was chronicled by Ida B. Wells, who also wrote the story of postal workers lynched in her hometown in Memphis and began her writing career around that. So postal workers in that generation were targeted with murder because of their independence, because it was a good job. And so oftentimes we aren't connecting that longer history to what's happening now. But it was a site of struggle and a site where Black organizations really strengthen access and strengthen people's resolve to do this work. I also traced the Pullman Porters, one of my favorite working groups to teach when I teach African American history. They are so important in thinking about history over time. The migration, they are key to that. They are sharing the stories of different cities and bringing those stories back home to their home communities. They're bringing Northern Black newspapers to sell on the trains in secret. They're helping people with those journeys. This chapter gave me also a chance to see how difficult it was to be a Pullman porter and the kind of patience it required. So I wrote about a man named Oscar Singleton, a South Carolinian who becomes a Pullman porter in the 1930s. Oscar had a very difficult time with people calling him out of his name. And so I have a passage about that. Over time, Oscar learned how to tolerate the intolerable. He learned to, quote, wear the mask that grins and lies, like that the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar so aptly described. Generally, he wore it so well that his passengers could not discern his true thoughts. When a passenger would say boy a few too many times or with too much enjoyment, he'd suddenly pretend that he couldn't hear them, activating the bell that passengers could use to call him and taking a seat in the next car. Oscar found that these breaks helped his, quote, segregated passengers learn that the call of boy didn't result in the best service. Most importantly, such breaks gave him time to breathe and a moment to let the tide of his anger recede. So for Oscar, the most difficult challenges of being a Pullman porter weren't the long hours or obliging passengers every request, but summoning the patience to accommodate people beckoning him with words other than his name. However, one day Oscar's tolerance bucket got a little too full. As Oscar was serving drinks to a group of women passengers, a man walked in and demanded immediate service. Oscar responded that he would be right back to assist, and the irate and probably drunk customer loudly demanded his drink and immediately began swearing and calling him a black son of a bitch. Oscar decided that he would tell the man exactly what he thought, in words that he refused to repeat to an interviewer more than 40 years later. His unfiltered response drew the attention of every other passenger in the car. The offending passenger reported Oscar to the white conductor, demanding that he be fired. That kind of demand was common. Oscar must have known that, as one porter wrote, quote, many men have lost their tempers and lost their jobs for the want of tact. When the train arrived in Chicago, Oscar was told to report to the main offices of the Pullman Company and that he would most likely be fired. But this time he would not be alone. The Brotherhood would join him. So the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was organized in 1937, the largest all black union in American history at that point, and they began to advocate for limits and controls on the lives of these men. They created set numbers of hours, base pay, and the kind of representation they needed in these conflicts with white passengers. A. Philip Randolph was the most storied leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, along with C.L. Dellums. But the story of men like Oscar reminds us that this support was so needed. What was amazing about that union was not only the work that they did for one another, but the work that they did for Black workers in general. A. Philip Randolph took that moment of organizing this union and turned it into a national movement for Black workers' rights across the country. He demanded federal access to federal defense jobs during the Second World War and got it by threatening a march on Washington and created what was called the March on Washington movement, which ended up being the March on Washington that we all know. There's a reason that A. Philip Randolph is in that footage when we go back and look. That's that long civil rights movement that he was part of in 1963, as the same as he had been in the 1930s. I also chronicle the lives of household workers. This was the work that my grandmother did when she first migrated from South Carolina, then to North Carolina, then on to Philadelphia. My grandmother had a high school education. She was extremely proud of that. She had hoped to get a job doing something clerical. She was really excited. She was a good reader, she was a good writer, and she was very excited about that possibility in Philadelphia. But she could only find jobs working as a maid, and she probably worked for a maid for more than a decade. I never talked with her about it. It's not something she shared with me. My mother told me decades after her death about that work. My grandmother was not alone in that labor. Um, Two-thirds of Black women working in America in 1930 were doing household work. Many of them came out of fields, migrating north, and ended up serving as household workers. Oftentimes, we think of this time period as the first era of women's work, when white women were called to go into work because their husbands were drafted to fight in the Second World War. The iconic Rosie the Riveter is the symbol of that moment. Um, but I discovered in the process of writing this book that Rosie the Riveter's children were watched by Black maids. Her dinner was cooked while she was out at work by Black maids. And the suppression of their wages made that possible during this time period. This kind of work took a toll on people. This photograph here is of Minnie, a woman I chronicle from Accomack County who migrates to Philadelphia and describes in great depth her work. Um, my mother used to tell a story about when she was little, and her mother was serving as a live-in domestic for a family in West Philadelphia. When I was growing up, my mother and grandmother would frequently tell me stories. Stories about my mother being a picky eater as a child, about my grandmother's job at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, about my mother's work in the typing pool there in the summers during her college years. They told thousands of stories, but when I was a child, neither of them mentioned that my grandmother had been a maid. My mother did talk about spending time with a woman she called Aunt Sis, a hairdresser who owned her own beauty shop in North Philadelphia. I did not understand until I was an adult that Aunt Sis was not a relative, but a kind woman willing to watch and care for a little girl during the week when my grandmother boarded in with her employers to be available to clean their house at all times. Worried that my mother would become more Aunt Sis's child than her own, my grandmother would spend her days and nights on a job that paid a bit more in the hopes that she could save enough to make a real start for her young family. Even though she had moved north with her husband and her baby to make a better life, my grandmother was left doing domestic work before and after the migration. This came at a cost. My mother recalled that once, as a tiny, not yet school age girl, she had visited her mother during her off hours at her employer's home. When it came time to return to Aunt Sis's home, my grandmother was forbidden by her employer to accompany my mother back from West Philadelphia to North Philadelphia. Still too young to read the street signs for herself, my grandmother tied a piece of paper with the name of Jerry Stop to a silky red ribbon and placed it around my mother's neck, telling her to find a Black woman riding on a car and to sit next to and ask for assistance getting off at the right stop. My mother did as she was told and found a stranger, a Black woman with a kind face, and asked her for help. The woman sat with my mother the way my grandmother would have if she could, chatting and soothing her worries. At the right stop in her neighborhood, the sister stranger made sure my mother got off the car, headed in the right direction. Watching her wend her way, she kept her eyes on the little girl as if she was her own. So the compromises that this generation of women had to make to do this labor were tremendous, and they wore away at the fabric of family and made things quite difficult. These women were also exempted from federal legislation that provided protection that was created during the New Deal. So the 8 hour a day, a minimum wage, Social Security, those kinds of protections that came into effect for other workers in this time period um, did not apply to household workers. They were exempted by law, encouraged by Southern legislators who said it was too hard to figure those things out for agricultural and domestic labor, which happened to be the majority of Black working class workers at the time. So when I reflect on the history, the work that I've done around Black folk, I was struck so much by what they overcame because of who they were, because of ethics of care and the kindnesses that they showed each other, the communities that they built and rebuilt as they took these journeys. So I want to close with one of the ideas that I think this history reminds us. The Black working class are not marginal within the larger Black community. In fact, the Black working class is central to the heart of the Black experience. Members of the Black working class aren't stigmatized as trash. Rather, they are lionized as leaders. They are helping lead a new multi-generational, multiracial working class movement today. And while race has been used by generation after generation of politicians seeking to divide and distract American workers from challenging the structural barriers that make it hard for the working class to get ahead, history and the present day are rich with promise. Indeed, if we better understand all the paths that Black workers have taken, we can see what might be possible. Thank you. Um, I think it might have been most challenging to think about household workers, in part because their labor is very atomized. So when you go into work in a household, you're by yourself. There really is no work site that is shared. The shared spaces that they had were in transportation back home, in conversation in their own neighborhoods. But in terms of their work experiences, that was harder to sort of depict and to pull out, because they were so alone and so isolated and often um, very much kind of anonymous. A lot of people hired these women without knowing their full names, knowing or caring anything about them, and they were really quite dehumanized. There's story after story after story of women who are very anonymous in those kinds of circumstances, not asked to sit down and not asked if they're hungry, not asked about their own families or their own children. So I think that was sort of the hardest piece of it. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Um, in part, what I found fascinating was the contrast between the laundresses and the household workers. Oftentimes, laundry work didn't pay as well. It was harder. It was more arduous. You had to travel. You had to get around. But women were attracted to it because they didn't have to be in white households, and they were less often the victim of sexual assault, because of that. And in part, when you see them organizing, they're talking about histories of sexual assault and wanting larger collective networks to protect them from it. And so, household workers very much speak to those assaults that happen oftentimes very regularly within households. Men in those households who thought of those women as easy targets and that they had a right to assault them because they were working in their own houses. Um, a woman named Ella Baker did the best woman in the world named Ella Baker, who was an activist in the NAACP and in the civil rights movement and one of the founders of SNCC. Some of her early work when she migrated north from North Carolina to Harlem was on something called the Bronx Slaves Markets, what she called the Bronx Slave Markets, where women stood on a corner and got solicited during the Great Depression to do day work. Oftentimes men would come to those corners seeking women to assault. And those kinds of corners existed in every major city, I found in my research. And so that vulnerability was absolutely at play for so many women. I think I have a, let's see if I can get, it's hard to dive back through a Prezi. This picture of the woman cleaning on her hands and knees. Um, my mother always insisted that the best way to do your kitchen floor was on your hands and knees. And she would never use a mop. And if I just got a mop, she's like, no, you're not really doing it. And I didn't understand it or connect it. And then when I read the oral history of Minnie Savage, she talked about being made to clean a drugstore in Philadelphia on her hands and knees, and how degrading it was and awful and how big of the space it was. And people were walking while she was on her knees. And so it's something I talk about in the book as sort of that an interesting moment of subjugation that those women experience. And so when I found that picture of the woman on her hands and knees, I was like, oh, wow, okay. hmm Um, I love that question. Um, I think, for most Americans, freedom is tied to a sense of sort of like financial power. Like, you're wealthy, you're free to just choose what you want to do and buy things and move about freely. And because Black Americans really didn't have wealth in this time period, but they did have, a break from enslavement. Those breaks were so important for them. So mobility is an incredible one where if things aren't going right, just sort of picking up and moving on and trying to do it somewhere else was really powerful and something you see in, you know, all time periods where people are saying, no, this is enough. I need to go somewhere else. Um, the freedom to raise their own children was a really huge one for so many Black women workers because in enslavement, they had been taken away from their children or um, not given the time to even care for crying children when they were laboring. And so centering their children was incredibly important. On one of my other book tour stops, a man said to me, um, my great grandmother was a laundress. And I remember being about 3 and waking up from a nap and seeing her pressing, with the heavy iron on these clothes. And he said, I never realized she was doing that work for me so she could be with me. And so that care that women can suddenly give to their generations is another tremendous mark of freedom. And I would also say the freedom to advocate for one another, to build those networks that are so strong. Um, Evidently, my grandparents in Philadelphia met each other. They did not know each other, but they were both from the Eastern Shore. My grandfather also farmed land from another man in the Eastern Shore who lived in Pensacola and had some extra land, and so he just let him use the land. So I'm like, well, they clearly had an Eastern Shore connection in the city. And so those networks that don't have formal records of any sort can be seen in the relationships that come. Minnie was also married a man from her hometown that she did not know until she got to Philadelphia. So um, the freedom to connect is also very important. Um, I have always loved history. I found my college entrance essay, which was hilarious. And it was like, I want to be a historian. But I did want to be a lawyer. and I wanted to be a judge, which is very funny. I'd probably be a funny judge. Um, but that quest for history was something that was really important to me, and I always felt like there were things that I was not being told, and there were things that weren't being shared with me. So as a middle schooler, as a high schooler, I would have my mom drop me off at public library, and I would just go and sit and read books and try and figure out what happened that I felt like was missing from what I was being taught. So it's a natural proclivity and a habit, and it's something I do constantly, even if someone wasn't paying me to do it. It depends on the time period. So when so in Washington D.C., for example, at the turn of the century, um, there's a beautiful book called Living In, Living Out, and there was a preference for fairer skinned women to work in very elite households in that time period. A little bit of had a little bit of education that would also buttress you up the line. But as time went by, those kinds of things faded away for most Black women, and so there really was a shift in the market over time um, that doesn't really create a dichotomy among women that's now easily to discern. Yes. There is, it depends again on the time period. So there's a time period in which you can see younger single women working in households, and then you see older women once they have children and they're married becoming laundresses, particularly in the South. Um, as the labor market deteriorates, however, with the Great Migration, Black women of all ages and all marital statuses and with kids are those are the jobs they can find in urban centers. Um, there were stories of children who just were in households by themselves for long stretches of time periods, not being supervised because their moms just could not find any other kinds of jobs. Um, so yes, but it changes as circumstances get more difficult, and it changes back over time where women are uh, not interested. In my mother's generation, for example, my mom got a job at a Learner shopping store in her hometown in South Jersey, and one of the requirements of working in Learner was cleaning the toilet. And so when my grandfather found out, he went down there and yanked her out of there and said, "You don't clean the white woman's toilet." No, that's not something your mother had to do. You don't do it. And so she couldn't keep her clothing store job, which she really wanted. Yeah, there's bartering of not only cleaning but seamstress services, milliners, folks who can make hats. So an economy of trade within the Black community, absolutely. But I was really focused on people who were doing it, for a living. Mhm. Mhm. So you see an upsurgence of Black women workers um, in beginning in the 1950s and 60s when they are when they're employment in most places is more common. In some places in the 1950s and 60s, they really were holding out and not hiring any Black workers at all. And so most of those places, Black men were the very first, but there were some notable exceptions of Black women working well before the 1950s and 60s. There's a Black woman postmistress in Mississippi who becomes quite successful in a Black town, for example. So there are women who are doing postal work, but because um, military veterans were favored, until you have a large number of women who are veterans, you didn't have that linkage as early. But by the 1960s, you see an enormous number of Black women in postal work. There's tons. I was really drawn to some of the jobs that don't exist anymore, as means of really teaching us, what was going on in those spaces. I think that they are at risk of being forgotten to a certain extent. So, um, and I've always been Pullman porters and washerwomen are like key. Like if I'm teaching the class, you're going to hear about those. You're not going to be able to get out of hearing about those jobs. And so when someone asked me, how would you organize this book? Immediately, I began to think of them. For me, the postal work was um, really key in sort of understanding a transition. But now that I'm doing these book discussions, I'm drawn to thinking about like what's next, and adding in um, whole other fields that I think would be important to study. So, in no way is this book intended to be comprehensive. Um, it's not. I don't know that a single book would be comprehensive and that people will want to read it. It get a little long. It's much harder for them to organize because of the how isolated they are. But there is a domestic workers union that gets formed during the Great Depression in New York City, and Richard Wright actually goes and sits and interviews a number of those women for a story he believes he's writing about domestic workers, which he does not. He ends up still writing about a man dressing up as a domestic worker. He doesn't write about women. He was not very good at writing about women or from a women's perspective. But those records were really interesting to sort of chronicle their voices because there are very few other papers about that organization. I hope so. I mean, she was such a big part of my upbringing and really the key to how I was thinking about what Black folk meant to me. Um, and so she probably would have fussed at me about it, but I was glad to know that part of her story and that it made me really admire her even more than I already did. So I hope that she would.